Welcome to the MSFS Global Challenges Series. My name is Nicole Bibin-Sadak, and I'm the Deputy Director of the MSFS program. Our topic this week is the great power conflict and the geopolitical landscape and how it is being shifted by COVID. We are delighted to welcome two professors who teach on grand strategy, Professor John McNeill and Professor Charlie Kupchan. They interview Dr. Anne-Marie Slaughter, the CEO of New America and the former Dean of the Princeton Woodrow Wilson School.
Hello, my name is Charles Kupchan. I'm a professor in the School of Foreign Service and a professor as well in the government department. And I'm a co-host of this conversation with Anne-Marie Slaughter about the impact of the pandemic on geopolitics and in particular on great power relations. I'm going to quickly turn to my co-host, John McNeill, who will introduce himself.
Hi, yes, as Professor Kupchan suggested, I am John McNeill, a professor in the School of Foreign Service and the History Department at Georgetown, and a frequent collaborator with Professor Kupchan in a course on grand strategy.
Good, well, let's dive into it. Our guest this afternoon is Anne-Marie Slaughter. Anne-Marie is the CEO of New America, which is one of the more influential and innovative think tanks in the country. Before taking over as head of New America, Anne-Marie was the dean of what was then the Woodrow Wilson School and was also a professor of international affairs at Princeton University. Unlike Professor McNeill and myself, she had the good sense to go out and get a real job, but she is as qualified as anyone I know to engage in a conversation about the pandemic, the moment that we are living through in 2020, what the world on the other side of the pandemic might look like. Thank you very much, Anne-Marie, for taking the time to join us and to share your thoughts with the broader Georgetown community. Welcome.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. Always happy to be back in the classroom, even if it's a virtual one.
Great. Why don't we just start off with the view from 30,000 feet and simply ask you to begin with some thoughts on the likely impact, the sort of broader impact of the pandemic on global affairs. Is the world post-pandemic going to look a lot like the world pre-pandemic? What's going to change? What's going to stay the same in your mind?
Well, let me give you two possible scenarios. I think the prediction business at this point is really dicey. Although this pandemic was predicted, or a pandemic has been predicted, and in very concrete terms for a good 15 to 20 years. But there's one scenario that says the pandemic is proof that the existential global problems we face, health problems, climate change, absolutely, all the associated problems that arise with climate change, food insecurity, water insecurity, energy, lack of energy, that those problems now absolutely need to take pride of place. I would say need to come first in the way nations think about their foreign affairs. This pandemic would force them to figure out new ways of cooperating. That will require a lot of updating of the infrastructure of cooperation for the 20th century. It will mean updating those institutions, but also adding new ones, bringing in non-state actors of all different kinds. But really, finally, people realize, if we do not cooperate differently, the whole planet goes down. The other scenario is that the health issues, the closing of borders, the fear that engenders, the economic crisis that is we're just still really beginning with the pandemic, The disruption of migration that allowed lots of people to leave their countries and go abroad and support their families through remittances, all of that breaks down. And what happens is that instead of moving forward to this more I don't know about harmonious, but more cooperative 21st century, you move backwards to the 19th century, and you're not only in great power competition, you're just in all against all. I mean, you have regional great power competition as well as global great power competition. And in that sense, the infrastructure of cooperation we built in the 20th century doesn't get updated. It simply dissolves in lots of ways. And I think either one of those is quite possible. And I think which way we go is some matter of luck, but also a tremendous amount depends on global leadership and how key global leaders think about these issues.
Could you take the next step and just identify for us the variables, the either ors that you think could tip the scales in one direction or the other? You mentioned global leaders. What else comes to mind?
So I will just say, if Donald Trump is reelected, the chances we go backwards go way, way, way up, because this depends. It really does depend in many ways on the United States having a leader who is at least amenable to working with other nations differently, to say, let's put these existential issues first. We still have rivalries. Nothing in my scenario says these rivalries are going away. We have lots of rivalries, but for people who watch Game of Thrones, this is a question of, are the different kingdoms fighting each other, or are they all going through a common external threat? But the United States has to be a linchpin in bringing countries together and thinking about how we are actually going to address these planetary existential threats, is what I'd call them.
Even if Donald Trump is not reelected, there are other world leaders who have shown, shall we say, mixed feelings about international cooperation. If you had to say which of these two scenarios is likelier in the event that Trump is not reelected, would you then say the more cooperative scenario is likelier, or would you still see that other obstacles make it less than a 50-50 proposition?
So we have to start from the proposition, I'm an optimist, and that, so what I want to see happen is going to colors my predictions. I still think it's a really hard go. So let's say President Biden takes office. He will definitely want to, first of place, de-escalate a lot of tension in various places, at least get, for instance, the relationship with China, even the relationship with Russia, toned down to a point where they're not likely to erupt in really dangerous ways. He's likely to re-enter the agreement with Iran, but that's not to say we're going to embrace these countries, just means we're going to reduce tensions. But he doesn't necessarily have the mindset that I think is needed. It is, there are lots of people who are embracing great power competition. It's not just Donald Trump. There are many folks who say, this is the world we knew. This is the world of the 20th century. We know how to play this game. NATO, knows how to set up against a potential an actual Russian invasion of Crimea and Ukraine, and a potential one of Belarus. So I think even with a new American administration, this requires not just a different mindset, but a different infrastructure. This is not what the State Department is set up to do particularly well. If you look at the power in the State Department, it's all the regional bureaus. It's the folks who deal with different countries. It's not the people who deal with issues. And of course, that's true of the Pentagon, although the Pentagon in many ways recognizes that unless you address climate change or pandemic, the security problems follow, and then they are on the line. So they're often more supportive even than state. But I think it will take building a new infrastructure. It takes connecting to different parts of other countries. It requires much more engagement of mayors and governors, because they are on the ground. Often they're the people that are closest to these issues. So it's certainly not, it's still probably, as you put it, a 50-50 proposition at best that we will move in the direction I think we need to go.
How well calibrated is the infrastructure of international institutions for dealing with a pandemic world and a post-pandemic world? You speak of the State Department and the Pentagon, but on the international institution level, do you see similar mismatches between structures and problems or not?
I do. And indeed, Professor Kupchan and I have been part of a project sort of trying to rethink what would you do with the existing post-World War II international order, the United Nations system, the World Bank, the IMF, all the ancillary organizations, running every part of the economy. I mean, of the global system. And it's very striking. And I don't think it's just Donald Trump's fault that we have not heard word one from the Security Council about the pandemic. And we obviously heard about the World Health Organization, but mostly we've heard about the United States and China. Although the World Health Organization has done some good things, it's also been subject to political pressures. But overall, I think if you ran a kind of study of newspaper headlines and articles all around the world back to the beginning of the pandemic, but probably even for the last couple of years, the role of those institutions is much less visible, certainly, and I would say much less prominent in being the place people are coming to address these issues. And it may be that they're just too big. Certainly the United Nations is really, really hard. The Security Council is too small, and the General Assembly is far too big. And then when you look at these other institutions, none of them have modernized to take account of the power structure of the world we're in. They're still basically the post-1945 power structure. So I think in some ways you have to get some of those institutions to reinvent themselves, or you kind of have to surround them. You use them as a hub, but you create a kind of cloud of other actors around them in different ways that allows you to address the problem. But we're not going to have a kind of new Bretton Woods or a new UN conference. So it's very, very hard to think about how you're going to modernize those institutions. And some may just get kind of bumped to the one side, and other institutions that work better will simply take the stage.
Let me bring in a couple additional factors in thinking through institutional efficacy and U.S. leadership, because I agree with you that the outcome of the November election is a watershed moment, and that if we're going to move into an era in which there's more cooperation on the pandemic, the U.S. is more important than any other country. But two issues I want to ask you to comment on, Anne-Marie. One is, as you said, we're not in a post-1945 world anymore, and the Western democracies no longer enjoy material preponderance. They're somewhere in the 40% of global GDP. China is going to be the world's largest economy in terms of aggregate GDP by the end of this decade. How does that shift in the global balance of power affect your calculations? And the other issue that I worry about, I'd be interested in your thoughts, is the longer term reliability of American leadership, in the sense that, okay, a lot of people around the world, with the exception of a few countries, are not big fans of Donald Trump, but the problems, the moment that we're living through, are bigger than Donald Trump. In some ways, he's a product or a symptom and not the cause. We've been oscillating politically from Bush to Obama to Trump to who knows what, in part because the political center in the United States is more or less gone for now at the elite level. I think it's probably still alive in the public, but certainly not reflected in Congress. Help us think through how those two factors play out, a more equitable distribution of power and an America that, at least for now, seems quite unsteady.
Yep. Tough questions. So on the first, I still do think that when the US and the EU pull together, we're not 50% of the global GDP as we used to be, but we're still much bigger than China for the foreseeable future. Now, but of course, China understands that, and China has very strong relations, particularly with the former Eastern and Central European countries, and China meets with those 16 countries, 16 plus one on a regular basis. So we need to strengthen our relations with the EU, but I don't think the US is ever going to go back again to the post 1945 world where it's Western Europe and the United States. We always had our tensions, huge. I mean, you and I grew up on those tensions, but still there was a sort of an assumption of we play together against Russia. That's much harder to do. But I do think if you look at the US, the EU, and now the Quad, so India and Japan and Australia and South Korea and the United States, you still got a lot of ability to push hard against certain countries and conceivably for certain outcomes. But again, that takes a very delicate diplomacy. Most of those countries, even take India, right? India is not lining up with us, and India is a democracy with a lot of problems right now. But even Japan or Australia, countries that are strong allies, they don't want to be forced to choose between us and China, at least not in a really tough way. Same thing with Europe. So the way you need to work to get the preponderance of power, as you put it, is quite different, and again will vary according to the issue. So part of the way we then need to lead is not to assume, okay, these folks are in our court and those folks are in the, whether it's China or Russia or much more local powers who are big enough to be a problem, but can be countered. You need a diplomacy that is much more about here's the problem we're trying to solve, and here are the nations we can line up in various informal ways or formal ways that are connected to an existing institution. And again, I don't think you can solve a lot of these problems unless you also bring in lots of non-state actors, which is much messier and much harder to do. So I think there are proposals at the moment, again, to have a concert of democracies. I smile when I see them because John Eikenberry and I proposed that back in 2006. There is a community of democracies in various ways. I don't think that's going to be the axis on which other nations are willing to line up in this century. I think it's going to be much more fluid than that. I do think a lot of people will line up behind open versus closed. If you say, we want open technology, open society, open economies, all of which hedged in lots of ways, because nobody wants those things to be completely open, but more open versus more closed. I think you can get somewhere there, but that's going to be on specific issues. So I think we've got the ability to get to a preponderance of power, to move an agenda forward on lots of different issues, but it is variable geometry, to quote the EU. And I do think your second point is very important. And Charlie, I'll take my hat off to you, Professor Kupchan. You were writing about this 8-10 years ago, looking at the way domestic opinion was shifting, when I think a lot of the East Coast foreign policy elite was, we got this, this is our world, and we've been making these decisions, we've been running US foreign policy for a long time. I think the rest of the world sees that the new American generation, and remember, we're going to be a plurality nation, right? We have the white people will be the largest single group, but they will not be a majority. Then you'll have the next group is Latinx, then African American and Asian American. You've got a very different nation. lots of those folks are very engaged with parts of the world, but not Europe. They're going to, but they definitely don't have the assumption that it is up to the United States, not even just to police the world, which very few people have ever wanted us to be the global policeman, but even to lead in the same way that our generation did. That to me means that lots of other countries are suspicious of how steady we'll be. And remember, Obama was pulling back. He wasn't pulling back as Trump did, but the division between Obama and Trump is that Obama believed in multilateralism and Trump believes in unilateralism. Obama absolutely thought we should get out of the forever wars, and he thought this reflexive, the United States is indispensable and we've got to get everybody else to move. That was not his starting point. So I think we have to reach a new consensus in this country, and the world will be watching in terms of how reliable a partner they think will be.
Anne-Marie, can you foresee any great power emerging out of this pandemic in a stronger position than before?
Well, I consider the EU to be a great power. In other words, the EU is the largest economy in the world, and I do think of them, as my husband has written, Andrew Moravchik, he calls them the quiet superpower. I think they may emerge stronger for several reasons. It depends, but they've really addressed the pandemic much better than other parts of the world. Not South Korea and Taiwan have been great, and Japan's had a low incidence, but they had the kinds of caseloads we've had, but they dealt with it much better. People are going back to school. The other thing is that I think actually Brexit is a good thing at this point in that certainly Britain in its present mood was just a spoiler if you had Boris Johnson. And it's shaken up the Franco-German Entente. So in ways that essentially say either we move forward or we're really in trouble. Now we're potentially losing members. So this recent decision to issue Eurobonds is very important. And the more united the European economy gets, so that we actually have, a central fiscal policy, a banking policy, I think the EU looks a lot stronger. I also think the EU, again, for the reasons we were discussing, is more of a pivot between it's traditionally been between Russia and the United States, but now it's much more the traditional role. When China was the great empire, they looked to Europe. And we were on China's other side. So I can see the EU being stronger as a power. I don't see, I think it's way too soon to tell with China because I don't think the virus is gone. And I also think the economic crisis the implications for China are enormous. I mean, China for the first time is not posting growth. And the impact from the rest of the world is terrible for China, much more so than 2008. And they don't have the tools that they had in 2008. So the conventional wisdom would be China looks great. The United States is going to spend 4 years picking up the pieces, and we'll see with Russia. I think I'd put my money on the EU.
You mentioned a second ago, Anne-Marie, that it's way too soon. Let me roll out a hypothesis and get you to respond to it. And that is that this discussion that we're having about the longer term geopolitical impact of the pandemic depends in part upon how long the pandemic lasts and how bad it gets. In the sense that, let's say we get a vaccine within the next few months and it gets rolled out, and by the spring, life is starting to turn back to normal. That is, I think, a case that would say, you know what, this is a very big deal, but not a history-altering event. Let's say that this kind of deepens and continues and starts looking more like the 1930s, right? Then we have to start worrying about populists in a big way. Then we have to start worrying about the potential return of militarism. Then maybe there'll be failed states here and there because they let's say the pandemic catches on in a developing country that doesn't have much of a healthcare infrastructure. So would you agree that in some ways it's too soon to make judgments because we don't have enough water under the bridge?
No, I would. And I would, and I think the second of those scenarios is more likely, because even if we get a vaccine, and this would be faster than we ever have, and all the people who have had a lot of experience on vaccines say, everything looks promising until you run it with 30,000 people, and then you have terrible side effects. And then even to manufacture it in the quantities we need, and who gets it. And so it can, both things could be happening. You could be having the first scenario, things are going back to normal in developed countries, and still have this ravaging many developing countries who are much less able to withstand it. And then of course you have real walls, because then those folks are bringing things back in. But there's also, the virus is mutating, and if it's more like the flu, where you have to do this every year, and the flu vaccine never, I got mine this morning, but that it's only going to get 60% of the strains. So I think it is absolutely too soon to tell, but I think it is much more likely to me. I'm not sure the 30s. I see this more as World War II, where it was 4 to 5 years. This might be 2 to 3, but enough that your life as you knew it is gone and everything is changing. I mean, women went to work, people, communities behaved in different ways. The economy was powered in a different way. You had all sorts of unrest, although as the war continued, you had a wartime economy. But that it's global, it's hugely consequential. And that as we come out of it, to me, the biggest worry is to make sure that we come out of it not completely divided. In other words, it's like as if you had World War II and then the 30s. So you have World War II and you come out of it, and there's some people who are doing really, really well, and there are other people that have had their lives completely obliterated. Their jobs aren't there. They've lost everything that they had, and we haven't succeeded in bringing them along. But I agree that probably in 6 months we'll have a much better handle on which of those scenarios is coming.
Anne-Marie, Charlie brought up vaccines. So as you know, Beijing announced that they've already deployed a vaccine. And then Putin announced the Sputnik vaccine not so many days ago. And of course, there's more than 100 labs working on vaccines. So there's now an international vaccine politics. Do you think that carries any real significance? Who gets there first? How good it is? Or is that merely an epiphenomenon, a sideshow?
Well, so this goes back to your previous question, and it's something I should have thought of. But if China really does have a vaccine that works, and it gets there first, and it rolls it out, and has the capacity to develop it and roll it out in lots of other countries, China, then I revise my view about which power comes out looking stronger. So yes, that's a scenario in which China would have been responsible for the virus, but they controlled it very quickly. They helped other countries medically. They then provided the vaccine. China looks much more like the scientific superpower that we were in medicine. We start to look like not only have we not been able to address the pandemic, but we've lost our biomedical edge. So if that's a scenario, if they really do have a vaccine that works, and I know their vaccine is, or at least one of their vaccines, is operating on a very different theory, yes, that could be a game changer. From what I know, again, that's way too soon to tell. The Russian announcement has been met with deep, deep skepticism. And you can imagine another scenario where China says it has a vaccine and it affects more people, or it doesn't work and people think they're safe, and then you have the pandemic coming back with a vengeance. The other issue again is, yes, we're seeing pictures in Wuhan of people crowding together. It doesn't take a lot, as we've seen in American cities, to have things take off. And for China shutting down the way they did, there was no economic activity. We've had 40% of our economy still going and maybe limping, but China can't afford to do that many times in terms of economically and even, I think, socially.
So you've been speaking about vaccine politics as a matter of soft politics and prestige. Can you imagine a hard politics of vaccine, that is sharing it with some and denying it to others? Or do you think that's beyond the pale?
After the last 4 years, I'm much more careful about what I rule beyond the pale. There are things happening in this country I never, ever, ever thought I could possibly live to see. So I wouldn't, it's interesting. It is, so access to some countries and denial to others sub rosa, sort of under the table, absolutely. You know, actually playing hardball, saying, you know, can you imagine China to Taiwan, for instance? And what would we do? Or any situation, obviously, if Russia had a vaccine, really playing hardball with the countries on its periphery? I suppose so, although that is where, you know, I mean, yes, I started by saying we either go forward to a very different vision of the 21st century or backward to the 19th century. That's the 19th century. You know, there are no real rules against the use of force. I mean, obviously, the United Nations system has worked really imperfectly, but it's still worth noting that we had very few straight invasions of one country against another, the way Iraq moved into Kuwait in 1991. And that was because with the United Nations Charter and the system of the Security Council, people, you know, fought proxy wars. They certainly still had conflict, but that real bare-knuckled, you do this or else, whether in bribery or coercion, it's hard from, it's a real departure from the world we've known, but I wouldn't rule it out.
Let me switch tracks a little bit and ask you, Anne-Marie, to talk a little about the work stream that you have been developing, particularly in the context of the joint project that you mentioned that we were in together, the Lord George Study Group on World Order, which to some extent marks the centennial of Georgetown School of Foreign Service. In general, when you talk about great power politics, you talk about state to state. Mm-hmm. And you read about Franklin Roosevelt meeting off the coast of Newfoundland with Winston Churchill. What was Berlin doing? What's Beijing doing? What's Moscow doing? You have what I would call a broader, more malleable view of the stuff of great power politics. You think that in many respects we're entering a period in which what you could call low politics or the politics of civil society is perhaps more important but equally important to the realm of high politics, state to state. Tell us a little bit about your thinking on that front and where you see opportunities for cooperation that may emerge, that may bubble up from below rather than come from formal diplomacy as we know it.
So it's interesting, even your words are not, so I would say you have interstate politics, and that's international relations, and that's sort of here. And I would call that, in the book I wrote in 2017, I call that the chessboard view of the world. You know, it's a set of games, can be many games, not just chess. It's chicken and stag hunt and poker and but it is a game played by capitals and only a few, as you describe, and that's the chessboard view, where it's really a game of strategy with a few powers, relatively few powers that matter, different in different regions, but probably no more than 5 to 10 on the global stage. And then I think above that, not below that, but to me above that is global affairs and global security, where yes, those states matter, but I see those states as simply major hubs in an entire web of networks. And so I think about the chessboard versus the web. And the web allows many players to be a part. So Bill Gates, Bill and Melinda Gates, who can create a foundation, and that foundation can create a global initiative to vaccinate 600 million children through the Global Alliance of Vaccines and Immunization, which they get going. But of course, you need governments, you need the World Health Organization, you need lots of pharmaceutical companies to provide the vaccines, and you need lots of civil society to deliver them. So that is exactly what I would call that. You have a hub, you have many different actors, state and global, or state and non-state. As non-state always defines these other actors by what they're not, but for these purposes. And there, I would give another example. If you think about climate change and you think about Bloomberg, another billionaire, but also mayor of one of the world's great cities, who then creates a covenant of 7,000 mayors. And that really matters, because those mayors can agree to reduce emissions, and they can actually reduce emissions, at least in their cities. And of course, you then have governors, and it's been interesting to watch the US response to COVID. Federal government has been terrible, but governors, and not just individual governors, but governors coming together to create compacts for how they're going to get the equipment they need or the testing they need, are very important. And then you look at, the governor of California essentially being like his own Secretary of State with Canada and Mexico and other states. So my vision there of the way we've evolved is, again, it's a global web. States remain very important. And when you have certain kinds of threats, yes, people will line up and you go back to the capitals. But there's so much opportunity for extremely wealthy people, again, foundations or individuals, for governors, for mayors, for CEOs. And you look, Apple just hit $3 trillion valuation. You want to compare that to the GDP of probably 100 of the world's countries? The power there is enormous. Now, it's not accountable. And that's immediately, who elected Apple? True enough, but when you're thinking about where is the power in the world that you need to bring to bear to either stop things from happening or make things happen, my vision of politics is that a chessboard vision is just really impoverished. And again, lends itself to great power competition, because that's what they're best at doing.
Why do you cast this as opportunity, in the sense that, I take your point. Off the top of my head, I could say there's an upside and there's a downside. There's an upside in that you have these new avenues or vehicles for cooperation, but you can also see Facebook and Amazon and Google as out of control, as platforms for the spread of extremism. You can see these groups as purveyors of, populists. Look at Steve Bannon out there organizing the right wing in Europe, and he didn't do so through governments. He did so through social media and all the stuff that creates the web that you're talking about. So, do you think it's neutral? Do you think it's positive? How do you get a handle on the geopolitical effects of a webbed world?
It's neutral. The networked world, the networked form is as fun. You go back to 1990 and you start seeing in sociology the shift from hierarchy to network, and that's early days of the internet, right? That is really, and but even then we're connected in different ways. Hierarchies have just become too big and too unwieldy. So you're seeing this in business organization, things are flattening out. the technology and the autonomy that the technology then enables. So anybody can have think about publishing. Anyone could have a blog. Anybody could, it's much easier to create a business, but it's neutral because you've got all these criminal networks that are, awful. And absolutely, I do not think a world in which, 5 or 9 technology companies rule the rest of us is anything that I'm looking forward to. But I don't think you can stop it. I mean, I think that is the reality of the century we're in. Why do I see that as optimistic? Because I've been excluded enough from those tables where those decisions get made to understand, and I'm privileged, and I was the director of policy planning in the State Department, so I don't have a lot to complain about. But for so many people, foreign policy is something done by a tiny, narrow, white male elite, or white male and female elite, but still not nearly enough women. So when I celebrate is the sense that if I'm interested in solving global problems, if I'm interested in foreign policy, I no longer have to go to exactly the right schools and hope I back the right person and I get appointed to the tiny handful of jobs. I can go to work for a foundation, I can go to work for a business, I can go to work for a civic group, and there's a real role for me. And I want the United States as an open society and as a society that is pluralist and committed, in theory, to a degree of equality, to be the country that says, hey, there's much more room for us. Doesn't mean this is all good, not by any means, and there's lots bad, but it is an opportunity that if we can think that way, we can design institutions and we can design constraints to make that more positive outcome more likely.
John, we've only got about 5 minutes left. Do you want to pursue this subject or take the conversation somewhere else?
Well, I just want to ask Anne-Marie whether she sees this relationship between, in her vocabulary, the chessboard and the web as one that is static or dynamic? And if it is dynamic, does it have direction to it? The reason I ask is because as I look back in the longer term past, I see moments of innovation when civil society acquired greater power vis-a-vis states as a result of, let us say, writing or printing or what have you. But in the longer run, states always seem to learn how best to exploit new developments in technology so as to return to their positions of power. I wonder if this time it's different or not.
So I think it's different. I think it's a great question. It is definitely dynamic. As I said, I mean, if you just look at networks, and I study networks domestically, in every different discipline, that's a dynamic that is happening and will increase, but it won't increase forever. Because the other part of networks is they are more open, they're more participatory, they're more flexible, they're more adaptable, and they're also a pain. Right? And Charlie, in his own writing, says, look, get 6 people in a room and you can make decisions. And even in the best networks often have hubs where you have a smaller number of people. So we're not just going to see the world go all into networks. People will rediscover the joys of hierarchy in many ways. It is a dynamic balance. I think we're on the network side of it, but it's definitely dynamic. The reason I think, though, it will continue, and this goes back to the very first question, the global existential problems we face cannot be resolved at the level of capitals of great powers. Right? This is not something you can reach an agreement as you can with nuclear weapons or the high seas or stopping a war. This is behavior change. So you think about the pandemic, you have got to get people to stay home and wear masks and social distance. If you think about climate change, they have to consume less. They have to drive different cars. They have to not drive at all. You need a much wider array of actors to actually mobilize fund, monitor, drive that kind of change. So if you go back to the problems I see for this century, and again, it's not either or, because we are going to have, what I hope we don't have great power conflict, but conflict between powers, and let's hope it's not military. Yes, there's more of it now than there was, say, in the 1990s. But again, I think the bigger threats are these existential threats, and I don't believe they can be resolved by the chessboard world. I think the chessboard world has a role to play. Do I want to see the United States back in the Paris Agreement? Yes, I do. But I think even if the United States is back in the Paris Agreement, and even if all these nations make lots of commitments about emissions reductions, it won't work without the web world. And the more we think about the web world and design institutions for the web world to mitigate the inefficiencies, to make it work, the better off I think we'll be.
Final question, Anne-Marie. Let's assume that it's November 2020 rather than August 2020. We've just had a presidential election. Your phone rings.
No, a better scenario. She gets so many write-in votes, she's responsible.
Am I able to mute other speakers on this call? And the president-elect calls you. Between the two of us or the three of us, I think it's more likely that your phone rings if Biden wins, but I don't want to prejudge. And the president-elect says to you, I'm going to do 3 things in my first 100 days when it comes to the world, when it comes to making the world a better and safer place. What should I do? What's on your list of 3?
So my first one, without any question, is the most important thing you can do for the world is to address the pandemic safely in the United States. I mean, if we're not functional as a country, the rest of it doesn't matter, at least in terms of our own role. So he has to look inward. Indeed, I would say, even though Joe Biden could be Secretary of State and certainly can be his own Secretary of State, that is not his job. He needs to focus domestically and send other folks around the world. I think in the first 100 days, the next thing I would do is to it's interesting, but reset the relationship with China. And there he has to do a lot of domestic work as well as global work, because he's got to create room to say, this is how we need to work with this country. And that's not just to lower the temperature and avoid conflict. It's because for a lot of these problems, we've got to work with China. And so we've just got to get to a different place, regardless of whether you're on the chessboard or the web. And the third thing may surprise you, but I would tell him to do 2 things domestically, but that I think would be hugely important. One would be to create a Goldwater-Nichols style commission in Congress to radically overhaul the State Department, to really overhaul the Foreign Service that was created in 1925 for a radically different world, and to create a service that would allow people to move in and out at 5 to 10 year intervals. I don't know exactly what the right number is, but precisely to create a service of folks that I'm talking about, people who'd been in business, people who'd been in the university, people who had been in civil society. And alongside that, I would make USAID, I wouldn't call it the Agency for International Development, but I'd call it something that was a separate cabinet department and that had the ability to institutionalize this global problem-solving perspective. And call it development. A lot of these problems are, we think of health, we think of water, we think of climate more in the development space. But the point would be, we need to then develop these institutions around the world. We can start by overhauling our own government in a way that enables us to do that, and working with mayors and governors and others, public-private partnerships. We want other countries to imitate that. And then if you do that in your first 100 days, then you are setting yourself up for, as I said, this deep mindset shift. It's not as simple as adopting a few policies. It's about a different mindset, different institutions, different players, Because without that, we can adopt the policies, but we can't make them work.
John, do you have any closing thoughts?
No, I think we've both learned a lot, Charlie, and are very much in the debt of Anne-Marie Slaughter.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne-Marie. May our next meeting be without Zoom, please God.
Indeed. Indeed.
Let's get through this moment and get out on the other end.
Exactly.
What a fascinating and thought-provoking conversation with our two professors and Dr. Slaughter. Let me pull out a couple questions which we certainly have to wrestle with as we think about what the international landscape will look like and which powers will emerge, maintain their position in the world, or potentially decline in their influence. First is the role of the United States. Will the United States be a consequential power? Will it need to be a consequential power? And what are the impacts of the United States maintaining that position in the world or not? Who will fill a vacuum that may be created by COVID? Are there other powers that will emerge and come to the fore because of the shifts that we're seeing thanks to the global pandemic? And last, what is the global infrastructure? What needs to change? Are we seeing a decline in the Bretton Woods system? And what will shape the shift, and to what will it shift? These are important questions that we have to grapple with as we think about what the world will look like following the COVID pandemic.